This is the Filipino sinulog dance, done to honor the Santo Niño de Cebu, an image of the infant Jesus kept in the minor basilica of the Holy Child in the city of Cebu. The origins of the dance are uncertain. Filipino tradition holds that it goes back to the days of Raja Humabon, the first Cebuano chief to embrace the faith after Magellan's arrival in the archipelago in the 16th century, when one of the Raja's officials danced after being healed by an apparition of the Christ child. The Sinulog dance was once performed by the faithful inside the basilica in honor of the feast of the Santo Nino. It's a grand spectacle which begins with a novena on the Thursday after Epiphany and culminates with the feast day itself observed on the third Sunday after Epiphany. In time, the number of devotees attending the festivities became too much for the basilica, and the Sinulog dances were moved to the square outside. The late 20th century saw the formal organization of these dances into the Sinulog Festival, with lavishly orchestrated celebrations on par with the carnivals of Latin America. It's estimated that around 1.5 million people attend the Sinulog Festival annually. But for devotees who cannot find room to perform the dance in the basilica or maybe are too shy to do so themselves, one can employ the services of the tigsinug, the candle vendors, usually older women who will perform the sinulog dance on one's behalf for the price of a candle. The dance is a simple movement consisting of two steps forward and one back, said to mimic the movements of a river current or sulog from which the sinulog dance takes its name. The dance of the Tigsinug is a prime example of what is often called Catholic folk piety. While anthropologists and theologians quibble about the precise definition of the term, I think it's safe to say that Catholic folk piety encompasses devotional practices and beliefs that are distinct from the official doctrines and disciplines of the church. It generally arises organically from the people, reflecting their concerns and their understanding of religion in a way that speaks to them without any ecclesiastical mediation. Folk piety is controversial within the church today, as it tends to get dumped on from every quarter. The progressive theologians of the post conciliar era held folk piety in utter disdain. For the progressive, something like the dance of the Tig Sinug was an embarrassing throwback to a pre modern conception of the faith, to a time when peasants begged saints for rain and believed in talking statues. These are the same avant garde intellectuals who thought even the rosary and the Eucharistic processions were too primitive. So you can imagine the vitriol they reserved for more rusticated expressions of Catholic folk piety. The conservatives, on the other hand, as exemplified by the communio Wegelian sector of the church, well, they might pay lip service to these traditions, but ultimately they mistrusted the visceral emotionalism of folk piety. Folk piety is suspect to the conservative because it's not intellectual. If only these Tig Sanug dancers would just go home and read von Balthasar and John Paul II and subscribe to First Things. Traditionalists seem to have mixed feelings about folk piety. While plenty of trads embrace folk piety as a tenacious holdover from the preconciliar era, I've also seen trads hold it in contempt because, well, it can look very pagan at times, especially to one gazing in upon it from an entirely different culture. For example, someone judging Filipino folk piety from a Western perspective. The point is that there is a bit of dissonance with how some trads view folk piety because it doesn't always fit into the assumptions they have about tradition or how the faith was expressed in pre modern societies. In other words, the discomfort is a result of the tendency of some traditionalists to equate the entirety of historical Catholicism with its 1940s and 50s incarnation in the United States in particular. Here, it's helpful to remember the dictum of G.K. Chesterton. People say all religions look different on the outside, but ultimately they all teach the same things. Chesterton says the opposite is actually true. Religions all look the same on the outside. They all have sacred texts, candles, vestments, prayer postures, and so on. but it's on the inside, that is, at the level of doctrine, philosophy, and spirituality, that their real differences become apparent. We thus should be hesitant about judging Catholic folk piety by mere appearances. Whether we're talking about the embarrassment of the progressive, the skepticism of the trad, or the smug condescension of the conservative, hostility to Catholic folk piety generally reflects a very rationalized, institutionalized approach to faith that cannot tolerate any space for what is not sanctioned, regulated, and exposited down to the last jot and tittle. It cannot tolerate the unrestrained emotionalism that folk piety evokes. Catholic folk piety is therefore something that is grudgingly put up with, generally considered only in terms of what it lacks. It lacks doctrinal precision, it lacks institutional oversight, it lacks any hierarchically structured pedagogy. It's inconsistent with the contemporary church's vision of catechesis. It isn't consonant with the lofty mystical treatises of the church's spiritual masters. I would argue, however, that the stubborn endurance of folk piety suggests we must look at it not only in terms of what it lacks, but what it provides. Folk piety provides people with a tangible connection to their religion in a culturally resonant way. It reminds them of the reality of the supernatural world. It gives them a Catholic experience that links them to their forebears. It encourages them to make supplication to God and the saints. Now, is this often accomplished in a crude, theologically simplistic manner? Certainly. But if you were to put folk piety and modernized pop Catholicism in a face off to see which does a better job engaging the people, my money's on folk piety every time. Filipinos have been performing the sinulog dance for 500 years. Will the pop Catholicism we see in most parishes today be able to boast of such longevity? For progressives, the simplistic nature of folk piety seems to border on superstition. The progressive is annoyed at the sorts of petitions folk piety evokes: prayers for rain, for romantic love, for healing, for money. The progressive bristles at these supplications. They smack of rusticated peasant ignorance. You should be praying for peace on earth, for brotherhood among men, for an end to racism, for social justice, they scold. But these needs are far too abstract for the folk pietist, far too removed from the necessities of daily life. You see, folk piety is simple. Its practitioners ask for their daily bread, burned by no scruple about things outside their immediate circle of influence. Is this not what our Lord wishes of us? Folk piety is not childish, though it is childlike, and that's a good thing. Folk piety is thus an example of authentic enculturation, or what used to be called Christianization. That is, taking the collective character of a people and orienting it towards the gospel in a way that is Christian, but still authentically ethnic. Understood this way, it's easy to see the difference between historic Christianization and the faux enculturation promoted today. Christianization is the way the gospel transforms culture. Today's faux enculturation is precisely the opposite. It's more about transforming the gospel in light of culture. Christianization whittles the paganism off of indigenous culture, leaving behind a core of ideas and practices harmonious with the gospel. Faux enculturation preserves and elevates pagan concepts at the expense of minimizing the demands of the gospel. This is why the Pachamama fiasco, for example, is not an authentic act of Christianization, but rather of faux enculturation. Today's progressives view enculturation as a two-way street where the gospel shapes society, but the gospel is in turn modified by the society in which it takes root. If you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend the new book, Is African Catholicism a Vatican II Success Story, by Os Justi Press, which has a lot of fantastic information on this subject. Now, many listeners may be surprised at the progressives' historic hostility to folk piety because, from today's vantage point, it can seem like progressives are pro folk piety. I mean, what about mariachi music at Mass? What about the Mayan adaptations? What about the Zaire Rite? Doesn't this all signify a progressive shift towards folk piety? Folk piety, by definition, consists of practices and beliefs distinct from the official doctrines and disciplines of the church. Folk piety is thus necessarily extra ecclesial, it's spontaneous, it's minimally regulated, it exists outside the confines of the institutional church and its liturgy. There is, therefore, nothing that approximates to folk piety less than bringing it into the Vatican, institutionalizing it, printing prayer services for it, issuing documents promulgating it. Folk piety ceases to be folk piety the moment you create a rite for it and try to institutionalize it. At that point, it becomes simply something that doesn't belong indoors, like when people try to treat a wild animal like a household pet. This is why, for example, the rosary cannot and should not be subject to institutional oversight. It's probably the most universal act of folk piety in the Catholic religion, and it ought not to be regulated with documents and legislation as if it were the creation of the institutional church. Furthermore, the new church's folkish adaptations are often the creation of committees and intellectuals which bear little resemblance to actual folk practices. For example, the rhythmic, happy, swaying folk dances incorporated into the Zaire Rite bear little resemblance to any authentic religious dance documented in the indigenous cultures of sub Saharan Africa. And again, I recommend the Os Justi book on African Catholicism for more on this matter. We therefore see that institutional attempts to bring folk piety indoors, so to speak, are actually acts of aggression against folk piety. The push to institutionalize folk piety is part of the same trend of hyper rationalization we have seen afflicting the church throughout modernity. Folk piety, as such, is not and has never been the problem. The problem is with our shepherd's misguided belief that folk piety can and should be institutionalized, with the resultant liturgical golem set up as an alternative to traditional liturgical practice. This forces folk piety into a role it was never meant to hold and asks things of it it cannot possibly deliver. Either the gospel has the power to transform culture or it doesn't. If it does, leave it alone and let it do its work. Yes, it may take decades or even centuries, but let the process play out. The act of trying to institutionalize folk practices by a positivistic bureaucratic fiat neither helps the cause of the gospel nor honors the folk customs it purports to protect. We need to trust in the efficacy of the gospel more, for it is the power of God unto salvation for everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek.